Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Team Tim. Wow, it is December already. My goodness. Let's see. Less than 18 days or so until Christmas? I don't know if my math's right. I don't know. It's hard. But yeah, hey, we're back here again with Tim and Jesse and our good friend Brian, who's a nerd, compliance nerd, and least trust and power grid, and of course me from Compliance Scorecard. How you guys been?
Doing all right. Still recovering from the holiday, I think. Right? It's this week has been busy. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, since you're chatting, come on up, say hello, do your thing.
All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Jesse Miller from Power PSA Consulting and creator of the Power Grid vCISO system. Basically, our mission is to help MSPs crack the code for delivering vCISO services at scale. And we do that through a proprietary framework that helps you create a linked customer journey all the way from messaging to account management.
Wow, it's almost as if you had that practice a couple of times.
Hey.
You threw in a new word now. Proprietary program. It's like,
yes.
I'll have to learn a little bit about that down the road. So, Mr. Schnurr, how you been, my friend?
Doing okay. Tim, I'm glad we're back on. We're at our every other week cadence here, so we're continuing to move from topic to topic, but we still have one of our favorite guests, Brian, here. I can't wait to hear his thoughts on vendor due diligence and third-party risk assessments. I'm Tim Schnurr, leasetrust.com, focused in the tri-state, and the tri-state, for any of you guys that don't know that, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York City area. vCISO, also data privacy, setting up data privacy for law firms, financial services, and doctors' offices.
Nice. Thank you so much for that. Brian, you want to come up and say hello?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me back on to talk about vendor due diligence. Looking forward to this chat and this time. Built, grown, sold, exited several MSPs over the years, had some fractional CISO, compliance readiness organizations, professional services, been a full-time CISO for 4 years for a fintech company, and hoping to share some insights on not only how to make compliance suck less, but this vendor due diligence stuff and security questionnaires and the strip search we all have to go through or perform. I think this will be a fun conversation. I think a lot of folks out there can relate to having filled out, hundreds of questions to satisfy risk nerds on the other end, so your client or yourself can move a product or a service forward. So I think there should be an engaging, fun one. Thanks.
Oh my gosh, you used my favorite word. Make it suck less. I always get yelled at when I say that. Like, Jim, you're not supposed to say that. And I'm like, well, we actually have a whole video series on we can help make policy suck less. Damn it, stop it. I actually I shouldn't make sure I used to own policy.sucks and compliance.sucks. I should make sure those things are still there.
At least it's more realistic and representative, right? And we're acknowledging that it's not everybody's favorite topic. And this whole easy button concept we see out there in our ecosystem drives me crazy.
You know what I say to the easy button?
Who saw that CMMC in a box this week?
Oh yeah. They're sock in a box, CMMC in a box. We've got boxers I
didn't see that.
You didn't? CMMC in a box? Yeah, don't even get me going. So, but I should probably say hello too, right? Since I'm here and need to do my own thing. Hey everybody, Tim Golden, founder and CEO of Compliance Scorecard, where we help you and your MSP have the risk conversation with your customer. I'm going to hopefully allow you all to lead and run today because this is my, third live stream, I think, today. So yeah, I'm going to need a little backup here. But yeah, anyways, excited to talk about, I don't know. Let's just, hold on, let's pull this up real quick. Vendor due diligence. Vendor due diligence, right? All the things back when we had the MSP. I mean, it was only 122 questions long, right?
Let's back up. Let's back up because Brian mentioned third party, right? And I think third party was talking a little bit different, right? Like in terms of, Brian, are you talking about like an investor due diligence or a supplier due diligence? Are you really sticking here with like the vendor, like what's in my stack, like
Yeah, I think
vulnerabilities in my stack?
yeah, a lot of what I thought we would talk about today, and we can take the conversation with that whichever direction makes the most sense. But I was thinking when I think of vendor due diligence, I think of somebody selling something to someone else, and before that customer we're selling to will consume our product or service, there's a questionnaire, or we could ask for our SOC 2 report or ISO certifications, or there's contractual commitments that we have to make around data security and data privacy. So that's usually done during that transaction, where the questionnaire or the request for certifications, or log into my portal and answer my 4,000 questions, and then they'll make some sort of risk determination. But Tim, what you shared, I think when I think about vendor due diligence, and as Simon Sinek, right, start with why. So I think it's important to say there's significance, there is relevance to doing vendor due diligence, right? We're all technologically married to one another, and before we get in bed with someone, we'd like to know a little bit about them, right? A little bit about their history, their practices, that kind of thing. So I think the why behind this is really important, right? Is we want to make sure that, hey, if they're going to be in our data flows, if I'm going to hire organization or plug in a platform or consumer service, and they're in my data flows, or they're critical to my mission or my business, right? I can't do what I do without this vendor's product or service. I think we want to know a little bit more about them in terms of, do they have a security program in place? Do they have any compliance, attestation, certification, authorizations, whatever it is? We need to do a little due diligence there, right? And so I think when we think of the why, it's around kind of the sensitivity to data, the mission, what are they doing for us? How are we consuming their service? Also, regulatory requirements, right? There's a lot of industries that require this sort of assessment and documentation that you've reviewed. Yeah, documentation, get that, Tim. So there's regulatory requirements to say, hey, we have a process to check our vendors out. And then also, like I said, for business continuity, I need to know if I'm going to consume a product or service from you and you're critical to me to delivering my product or service to my clients. From a business continuity perspective, I need to make sure that you have the right stuff in place, because if you're down, so am I.
Right.
If you're screwed, so am I. So those are the kinds of things that we want to make sure, and then it goes into incident response and some other things. But I have a fun way later, when the time's right today, to talk about how to kind of take some of the brain damage out of vendor due diligence and vendor risk assessments, and put the resources where they matter most by tiering those out. And I have yet another framework to share, but it's a fun one around that.
Is it a proprietary one like Jesse's?
It will be after today. Tim, we'll get hooked up with that IP copyright attorney, and we'll be golden. But love to share a little bit more about that later. But what do you guys think about vendor due diligence? And either you're representing a client, right, Jesse? You do this where you're representing a client, especially as part of a VCSO program. Part of that is you're helping your client perform vendor risk assessments, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. And I think this is one of the hardest things, or this is what makes this one of those things that nobody really does well, because it's really hard and it has tributaries that stretch out into almost every part of the organization, right? So when I put this up on LinkedIn today, on my page, I said it's the biggest threat you're not thinking about, right? Yeah. So there's so many things that an errant vendor relationship could cause dramatic downtime in your organization, what you mentioned, Brian. So just at a high level, I think you mentioned this, but talking about tiering and understanding, before we can understand how a vendor is critical to us, we have to understand what our critical systems are and how they interact with those. So I think the first thing you have to do is create a level system of what type of vendor or what category of vendor is this for me. So maybe that's where we start.
It's interesting. I love the concept of categorizing, and I don't know. I'm double talking. I do like the concept of categorizing, but I feel like it can get too deep. Right. So maybe making sure that if you are looking at all the things in your business, Canva, I don't know, we use Canva. Do I care about Canva? Is it critical to my business? No. AWS, yeah, critical. StreamYard, maybe somewhere in the middle because we're using StreamYard today. Yeah. So, trying to ensure that not only, an asset inventory list of all the things in our business. Right. Something Maureen and I have been working on recently is making sure we know what those things are. But, Jesse, you mentioned categorization, or Tim, what would you want to be able to categorize things like accounting and finance or in website and in software? Like, now we're getting to the whole QuickBooks chart of account stuff.
Yeah, it's like probably criticality, right? And
it's a impact is how I think about it.
It's a decision tree. I mean, you had a questionnaire of 120 questions. You probably didn't go through that with Canva, right? But AWS, I bet you went through that whole list, right?
Of course I did. Of course I asked them, do you store process data? Do you have classified info? Of course I did not do that with Canva.
Do you have fire extinguishers in your data center?
That's right. Yeah. In case the cloud catches on fire, I'm going to pull out the fire extinguisher.
Right. Exactly. So there's got to be some kind of decision trees, and Brian, I don't know if that's in your proprietary,
it is actually,
right? Yeah. Like, in terms of criticality, in terms of data sensitivity, regulatory, right? Like all these kind of things that, you have to comply with that will drive your level of effort in terms of diligence.
Okay. So, okay. Sorry, I have to interrupt and point something out. So this was how forward-thinking I was, let's see, in 2016 when I was starting to build out the MSP, and I had this vendor questionnaire. I'm going to pull it up. Look at the question that I have highlighted right here. Number 55, does the company have a secure design lifecycle? Like forward-thinking, CISA, right? CISA
just put this stuff did exist in 2016.
I know, but were MSPs asking that? I was like, oh my God.
I don't know if CISA existed in 2016.
But I was asking way back then. I just looking back through this from
what year they established themselves.
I digress.
Yeah, but I think.
Well, so here. Oh, go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jesse. Because I think you brought up a great point that I'd love to build on here in a second.
Yeah, let me insert this and I'll let you go. Is that the way I think about categorization, if I had to put it in a sentence, is business impact. So what is the effect? How can I enable the business? Like you said, I don't want to stop marketing from using Canva while I go through a month of security back and forth for a DDQ, right? I want to say, how critical is this to the business? If it's a low criticality or transactional type of service, we're going to just monitor and go on and use it, right? So that allowing the business to move faster is how I want to think about ranking. And so take it from there, Brian.
Yeah, for sure. And that's exactly what I wanted to kind of put an exclamation point on, Jesse. And we started off talking a little bit about why, but the what and the where is where you start to say, okay, these are, I'm working with my client, and these are the client's critical business functions that drive revenue, right? And within those critical business functions, there's people, process, technology, right? Humans doing things with tools. And when I think about that, I think of, okay, there's systems and functions. There's a CRM function, there's a sales function, there's a accounting function, right? Those kinds of things. And they use applications, they use vendors, they use all kinds of things, right? In terms of either servers and other infrastructure or cloud services or other things that drive those things, right? So when I think about vendors, and this is where my super proprietary framework comes in here, and this is where I need the MSPs, and I think, this is where we'll probably get some, where I can hear the eyes rolling in the audience, but it's MSPs, we use that, and we saw Tim do it a little bit here too. Engineer side of our brain comes out. We want to over engineer this and overthink it and make it way harder than it has to be. Okay.
I don't do that enough.
Well, I know in MSPs it's analysis paralysis, and it's like, okay, I'm going to do this, and oh my gosh, I'm going to have 12 different tiers or buckets, and based off this is the kind of script search they get. And if you've never done vendor risk assessments, lean in here for a second on my very proprietary and highly sensitive, soon to be copyrighted framework called here's what it's called. I don't have a good name for it. I'll just call it Kids, Pets, and Plants. Okay. So when you think about a babysitter, and you're going to have a babysitter for your kids, or someone to watch your dog, or someone to water your plants. Okay. That's how I kind of want to approach and talk about kids, pets, and plants. So if we think about kids, I think of that as our critical vendors, right? Do we all have kids on the panel here? Jesse, I know you do. Tim?
Yep.
Yep, Tim. Yeah, so when we think about if we're going to hire a babysitter to babysit our kids, would that require a higher level of scrutiny and assessment versus someone that we might dog sit or watch our cat, come in and feed our cat?
We got a turtle.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I don't know. I feel like we take our dogs very seriously and we vet them, as you can tell. So maybe for us, we're the exception to that rule. But I think I hear where you're going, Brian.
Yeah. So I think of tier one of our critical vendors, right? We can't operate if that vendor is down or that vendor is so intertwined with our data flows that if they get poisoned, we get poisoned too. Or it impacts our ability to deliver and service our clients, right? They're so critical to our business. And let me stop here because I've gotten criticized in the past, and I want to mitigate that here. Is when I say business or driving revenue, it could also be, if it's a nonprofit, their mission, right? I would still argue that a lot of nonprofits do a lot of fundraising and a lot of money is important, right? But it's really the vision or the mission, right? So tier one, kids. And with a tier one kids type of vendor, I'm going to put together a program, and I'm going to spend most of my time on my vendor risk assessments right there. They're going to get a higher level of scrutiny. Not only am I going to want to send them a questionnaire, and I'll get to the questionnaire in a second, but not only am I going to send them a questionnaire, I'm going to have it be open-ended questions. Tell me about your security program. Tell me why I should trust you. My brown M&M, my favorite question to ask on a questionnaire is for them to rate their security on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being awesome, world-class, 0 being non-existent. That question alone, I ask them to rate it, and then I ask them to tell me why they rated it that way. You can tell so much about the maturity of a vendor based on that response, right? I've seen them rate themselves as a 10, world-class security, right? But yet other questions, they don't have any policies, they don't have a program, they don't have anybody designated being responsible, they have no business continuity plan. And so that to me is an area where you zero in on the questionnaire. But you also put in contractual contingencies around compliance, around breach, notification, those kinds of things you build in. But you want to spend most of your time on the babysitter for the kids. Okay. So that's where I say, hey, we want to focus on the kids, spend our time there because the stakes are higher. Right. So they're going to get the full security questionnaire. We're going to ask for audit reports. We're probably going to ask a little bit more about their incident response plans. Again, tie them to contractual obligations and MSAs, DPAs, and the like, and then monitor them pretty closely. Okay. Pets, tier 2, right? we love our pets, Tim, right? Some of us are dog people, some of us are cat people, whatever that is. But at the same time, I'd like to think that I'm going to take my babysitter through a little bit more scrutiny if they're going to spend some times with watching my kids and taking care of my children versus my pets. Okay. So with the pets, there might be, that's supporting more non-critical functions, right? If that vendor had a problem, they're not in our data flows. Yeah, it would be annoying. It would cause a bit of a problem, but we would still be able to function, right? And then the last tier that you don't spend a lot of time on is the one watering your plants. My wife might disagree because she loves her plant,
Brian,
but at the same time,
I'd even say watering your lawn because it's outside your house.
True,
right?
True.
Plants is like you're still getting in there.
Yeah, the physical security aspects of it, of people that are in your house. And where we see that oftentimes is where people say, oh, they're just the janitorial service. They just come in here at nights and weekends, walk wherever they want, and have access to file cabinets and unattended access everywhere, right? That to me is where you would really question. And this is the most important thing that people mess up when it comes to vendor risk assessments. Okay, two things. When you evaluate a vendor, you need to evaluate the use case. How is my organization using, think of Microsoft. Oh, I vetted Microsoft, they're good. Really? On what multitude or accordion of products did what's your use case? How are you consuming that product or service? Who's using it? And what part of the business is it being used or consumed? That's the biggest area, is the risk nerds will evaluate and say, oh yeah, Microsoft, they're good to go. Right?
Really?
Are they? Right? Well, I'm making that up, but I mean, most people, oh yeah, we looked at their SOC 2 report and we put them through our vendor risk assessment. We closed that ticket. Whatever you want to consume from Microsoft is good. And so there's two things that get screwed up there. The person doing the risk assessment doesn't understand the use case and how it's consumed, because sometimes we'll do a vendor risk assessment on an organization, a vendor, and they might not be up to par or up where we need them to be in terms of a risk profile, but we can put in compensating controls. We can say, all right, vendor, we'll let you work with us, but you don't have these things in place. We're going to put a contractual contingency that you have to be SOC 2 Type 2 within 12 months. At the same time, you're going to go under our access controls, right? We're going to do things to shrink our risk, so we're not as technologically married or connected, okay? The other thing is, use cases change. So people do not have, a lot of organizations for their vendor due diligence don't build in change management along with that, right? Because a vendor's risk profile can change, and also what we're consuming and how we're consuming it changes. So those triggers have to be built in. But if we think about this, don't overthink it. If we can think of kids, pets, plants, and look at it from that, hey, I'm hiring a babysitter to either watch my kids, take care of my pet, or water my plants, and start tiering them out that way. And that's just another way, I think, to think about it without getting caught up in our underwear over SCRM and what is it, Tim, NIST 161 or whatever that is on supply chain risk management. Without getting all caught up in those, if we can kind of start there and understand the pragmatic concerns, we start to build a more meaningful, I think, thoughtful
So what I think I heard you say is, when Compliant Scorecard decides to build out something around vendor due diligence, we need to call it kids, pets, and plants. It is such a huge challenge, right? You know what? I'm going to let Jesse or Tim chime in because I could talk for hours.
I was going to pull some stats. I mean, before we even jumped into kind of why this is important, right? I mean, think about, everyone knows, I think everyone on the call here knows like Robert Chiaffi, right? Like you say, what is it, July 20, clearly a kid, right? Clearly critical to the business, lost a significant amount of clients, right? Like, so the risk is real. I mean, CrowdStrike, Delta Airlines, right? I mean, what you can kind of go down the list. And I think you're digging into something, Brian. And I think it's great that you're triaging, as you said, in terms of criticality. There's probably another element of that as well, right? Like in terms of how much exposure do they have, right? I mean, it could be a critical vendor. Maybe it has a lot of exposure. So if it's on every endpoint, or is it something like, AWS server based, right? Tim, I don't know how your stack is set up, but
okay.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I think there's all the stuff there I agree with. There's not much to say about it, but I think some practical outworkings, I know, for example, in some of the programs I've done in the past, is writing a quick business use case for what's approved. You talk about that change management. Yeah, and I think the stoplight, the kids, pets, plants kind of rating is a good way to go to get started. and you could fit them into any one of those. Once they fit into one of those buckets, so to speak, you run your process on them. But you might have someone who's rated as a critical vendor. They don't meet requirements. And so you say, okay, we're going to bump them down to a medium vendor, which means they don't get access to XYZ, but we still have this particular business use case. Now, if our team wants to use them for these other things, they've got to do the change management and resubmit the request. So you got to build those processes. And I think that's important, right? The other piece is then it's not just how they enable our business, it's particular threats that their access could pose to our business. So I think we just talked about the positive side. What did we use them for to enable our business? And then the negative side, what risk do they pose to our business? So I just saw, I think it was today, but it happened like 2 days ago. There was this Clearway Pain Solutions got a $1.19 million fine because they had a contractor that they forgot to shut access off for, who then accessed 34,000 records and submitted 6,500 fraudulent claims using that data. And then when they went in and did the OCR audit, they had no program in place of any kind. And this is not a big business. I think there were like 200 and some employees on LinkedIn, right? Nationwide. So this is not a big business. They just got hit with a 7-figure fine because they didn't have appropriate vendor controls in place to lock out access and to do that change management and shut vendor access off when they're done. So why am I saying all that? It's like the segue into, once we've approved or gone through our due diligence with the vendor, there's that vendor management piece, right? So ongoing, how do we protect ourselves from vendors? So that's where I'd maybe like to get thoughts from people next.
Yeah, for me, that's always been a matter of focus, right? Especially the ongoing component to it. If I simplify this even more, if I think of 3 tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, I think of tier 1, I always relate it back to the data flows. So tier 1, critical to our mission, they're in our data flows, right? Tier 2, they're in our data flows, but they're not critical to our mission. Tier 3, they're neither in our data flows and they're not critical. So that's kind of where I start. And if they're a tier 1, this is where I don't want to get into proper nouns and names of tools, but there's some decent ones out there, especially if you do a 3-tier system where you can, not only do you set them, you do the initial risk assessment work, but the ongoing monitoring component, you can monitor them just like a credit score, right? And what I like about some of the vendor risk assessment platforms out there, there's a couple that are pretty good, where you can monitor that vendor, again, just like you would a credit score, which is behavior based, which I love, right? So you say, so I can say I have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Think about a credit score, right? So tier 1, I have to have you at 700 or higher. Think of that just like your credit score. Tier 1 is 700 or higher, and I'm going to monitor that. That's all in PCI and other frameworks here. So I say, okay, if I'm going to monitor this vendor's behavior over a period of time, if it goes below 700, I'm going to dig in. That's going to send me an alert. I'm going to get in and I'm going to figure out why, and I'm going to have a conversation with them. Yeah. Right. And so that's a great way to, in the behavior-based monitoring on that too, what I love about it, it's just like your credit score on some of these too. Just because, for example, if I miss a payment, let's say I have a payment and I miss it, and it gets reported to a credit bureau, just because I pay it the next month on time doesn't mean that goes away, right? It impacts my score. It dings me. and my score goes down for a little period of time until I've earned back kind of that number, right? It's not that immediate gratification where I can go in and I say, oh, I paid you on time. And then oh, okay, everything's fine. We trust you forever and always. And now your score automatically goes back up. So Jesse, what I like to do if I can kind of have those 3 tiers, just like we talked about, kids, pets, plants, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, I can start assigning numbers to those. And then if I'm monitoring and they go below a threshold, then I can get in touch with them. And I'll tell you where the rub often is, though. You can come up with a great 3-tier system, right? Yep. I've been in this as CISO before, and Jesse, you probably know what I'm talking about too. As CISO, where it's like, hey, we have a mature vendor risk management program put in place, right? It's well documented. We have scoring. We have the whole thing. We know how to do it. And sometimes the business comes back and says, no, we're using this vendor. No, we're using this product. Right? So guys, I'll pose that. You can be the greatest risk nerd and most comprehensive risk assessment on your vendors that you want. But sometimes the business says, no, we're using them. What's been your guys' experience with pushback from either a client or from, if you're a CISO or performing vCISO services where the business says, yeah, we're moving forward with them. They're the only provider that can do this, or they're the only ones that can do it right away, or they've got the best price, or whatever that is. Sometimes the business pushes back.
Yeah, compensating controls, right? Like, I mean, if you're lucky, I mean, if you've got a veto, great. It's, as you said, if it's a unique vendor, they're going to go with the vendor. But what can you put in? Definitely pound the table on the risk. Right, Brian, that you're pointing out, but there's going to have to be compensating controls.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have some personal experience with this, and there's specifically something comes to mind that I know this is a pretty major issue is, and not unique to this industry, but in pharmaceuticals, because you have years of development cycles with a manufacturer vendor, and they're the only game in town. Like, you have 2 or 3 years of sharing trade secrets and test data and trial data and manufacturing data, and you just simply can't go away from them. And we know in the healthcare industry that not everybody has the best security. So what do you do in that case? Well, I would argue that you just got into the supply chain defense business. For those who aren't familiar with that acronym, we're starting to see it more, that term. You're really going to start to run a security program for your vendors as best you can. So you can talk about, is that fair? Should we have to do that? No, we shouldn't, but we're trying to make the organization secure. And so I think, Brian mentioned some of these monitoring tools. Those are really good for, running third-party attack surface management stuff, being able to spot issues. Like if they have a 0-day vulnerability pop up, you get a focus tag pop up and tell you, hey, there's an exposed XYZ vulnerability that's got an EPSS score of 90. Like, this needs to be fixed now. So you got to call them and be like, hey, you have this going on. You need to get this fixed, or we're going to shut off connections right now until it's fixed. Okay. And do those mitigating factors. Likewise, if you're monitoring, for breach and doing threat intelligence, if they experience a breach, then you're proactively shutting off access to systems and doing things like that. So you're basically trying to help them improve. And for those tier 1 critical vendors where they're required, they're in the supply chain, they're in the manufacturing process, there's nothing we can really do. So we're just going to have to try and use our expertise to help them kind of bring them along with us on the journey. And so that's how I see it from like a pragmatic perspective, is how you have to handle it, right? And you have to document that the risk is there, and there's not much more you can do past that.
Yeah, Jesse, I was going to ask that question in terms of like ongoing due diligence and monitoring, which Brian talked about. I think it's a tough ask. You don't always have access to them. Like that initial access, I think you get a much deeper view, right? Like, what are you doing for MFA? What's your culture? Like, all those questions are so it has the ongoing stuff's a little more non-invasive, right? It signals what kind of telemetry you got out there. You mentioned EPSS, so you're scanning. If you have access to the code or source code, great. you can kind of see their software bill of materials. But from an ongoing perspective, Brian, is there anything like, how are you doing that, right? Like, insurers don't do a very good job with this, right? Like, they ask a questionnaire and it's a check the box activity, and then a year later they kind of go through it again, right? So
yeah, when the business really pushes back and wants to use a specific vendor, depending upon the criticality, that's the level of pushback that I do. And generally speaking, back in, I remember I was CISO at a fintech company, and had this situation, right, where a critical vendor, they were nichey. The business wanted to use them. It was it solved a business problem, right? And so the best thing I could do is work with the legal team and put in contractual contingencies around, hey, within 12 months, you're going to get ISO certified. Because you know what? That vendor wants to continue to sell to us, right? We're a bigger fish. We have leverage. And when you have leverage, that's generally when you can ask for things in the contract. And you say, hey, we love you. We want to use you, but you don't have any program in place. You can't prove any of these things are in place. So we're going to have, Tim, you mentioned some compensating controls. What are those? We're going to handle all the access control. We're going to define this hard boundary. We're going to get MOUs in place. We're going to do a number of things. But the number one thing I can do is start imposing the fact that they need to get a formal program in place. By doing that, I say, hey, you have a year contingency to be ISO 27001. And also, while you're doing that, is we want to see your quarterly vulnerability scans. We also want penetration test results with it. Again, you have leverage. You put these things in the contract, and then you check in on them. Hey, the contract's been going pretty good. This is my 1 or 2 month check-in. How's it going with your, I want to see your engagement letter with the audit firm. I want to make sure that these things that you promised that you would do are real. Right. So contractual contingencies, if you have a business says yes and you're saying whoa, then that's usually the best avenue to go in, is start imposing, getting them up to a standard over a period of time and working with them. And I think I heard it earlier, where we're actually helping the vendor improve. And I think we're going to see so much of this with CMMC.
I was just about to say that.
CMMC is these little manufacturers and all this, they provide niche-y things, right? We're working with a couple now where it's like they provide they're one of the only people on the planet, this little manufacturing firm that supplies these little connectors that a DoD contractor, right? These little connectors. And so now what the big company is saying is, hey, I have to help my little supplier, right? I have to even maybe fund them some money or supply some of my information security resources and compliance resources to start helping some of my suppliers get up to speed, right? So we're all going to improve, but I think we're going to see when we talk about vendor due diligence and supply chain risk management, CMMC, the business is really going to push back because they're going to say, and Jesse, you mentioned this earlier, but there could have already been a number of trade secrets, CUI, whatever it is flowing back and forth. But more than that, I can only produce my thing
with them,
with your thing.
Yeah.
Right. If I don't have your thing and I can't use you, I have to help you get to a standard over a period of time.
And so you bring up a really good point, not just with CMMC, but it's a good catalyst, right? I probably have the CMMC conversation a dozen times a day, but thinking about that whole risk chain, this one particular vendor does this one particular thing, all the way back up to the Boeings of the world. And if Boeing can't produce $1 billion plane because one little component they can't get, what does that do for capitalism down the road, right? It's oh my God, I can spend so much time here, especially on the CMMC component. There's so much bad education out there on what is considered security protection data, what is considered FedRAMP. Oh my gosh, Brian, you talked about the contractual obligations. Let's bring this back to the MSP space for a second. I'm an MSP. I use an RMM. I need to be able to help my customer with CMMC, but I can't use your RMM anymore. Now I can't do my job because of some third-party tool, some third-party thing, right? So do I, as the MSP, have leverage now with our SOC, our SIM, our SOAR, our XYZ tool? Do I now have leverage to say to them, hey, I want to use you, I want to keep using you, but my client base can't? Can I use that as leverage for renegotiating contracts or getting out of a contract?
Depends on how much your spend is.
100%. Yeah. How much leverage do you have, right? And I think, Tim, to answer your question in a more practical sense, I think that you are a voice of many that are probably going to that vendor, right? If you think about an MSP, a lot of the vendors already either have a GCC or a government or DoD sort of offering that they're working toward. And so you're seeing that, and Tim, we've talked about this FedRAMP equivalency and some of these other things pop up relative to CMMC. But I think a voice of many, going back to a vendor that's popular in the MSP space, or a provider of a PSA, RMM, fill in the blank, that they're going to be forced. Otherwise, really, you have no alternative as an MSP. You either don't go after this business that's in the regulated environment, right? You avoid the risk, or you have to switch products. You have to go to a different tool or product that is.
Just thought of a whole new business idea. We need to build, you know how they have these online petitions to petition your senator? We need to put an online thing together so MSPs can petition their vendors.
That's a fair idea. I like that idea. It's interesting that CMMC is really, I would say, one of the first times we've seen, people complain because it was so onerous and it's so rigorous, but I think we're seeing that. Well, no, it's not, right? But I think we're seeing that it's actually being enforced. And so you're seeing people actually do it. Like I mentioned my experience in the healthcare industry, right? Well, up till this point, there hasn't really been a lot of enforcement or teeth forcing any of that. So we were like, we'll do it when we get to it, Whereas CMMC, it's like, you'll do it or you'll be out of business. It's a little bit of a different perspective, right?
Government, right?
Yeah. So interesting.
I think there's waivers for years, right? FedRAMP equivalent, as you said. So only one manufacturer produces that one widget or service or what.
Yeah, I think waivers are going to be very scarcely used. I gotta believe that that's going to be the exception to the rule, and I gotta believe it have to be on some large or significant scale. It's not going to be a one-off waiver. I've got to believe, again, it's going to be something that is unusual occurrence. I think the big mistake I see most oftentimes with CMMC, as it relates to even vendor due diligence, is they jump right to control gap assessments instead of scope assessments.
Yes.
And when you think about, some organizations, it's back into the PCI days, where PCI, you'd say, hey, I'm going to segment out my network, and I'm going to have my point of sale equipment on its own little island over here. So what does that do? That shrinks the boundary, and it shrinks the level of effort around compliance. I don't have to have my whole network be PCI compliant. I just have to have this segment of it. Same thing with CUI and FCI is that once you understand the data flows, right, you can do the scope assessment, draw a circle around the boundary, and enclave it or shrink it. So then the vendors I use and the things I consume in this little bubble, it's not my whole organization. I don't have to do this for everything and everybody. I can enclave it, or I can shrink it down, shrink my brain damage, save some brain cells, shrink the level of effort, shrink my cost, and shrink my friction in my operation.
Yeah. But Aunt Sally in HR needs to be able to read that CUI document and get into and look at that schematic, because, she's in HR and it's part of her job because she's always done it, right? The number of times that has come up over and over, just because they did doesn't mean they should. That
Well,
scoping conversation is always important.
well, that and then the long pole in the tent on compliance readiness sort of engagements is always, Tim, to your point, changing behavior, right? And that's the pushback on a lot of compliance readiness sort of engagements. It's not really the cost. The cost is, I'm not saying it's insignificant. There's a cost decision, but the number one question I usually get from business stakeholders is, what kind of friction is this going to put in my operation? Hey, we do things a certain way. How are you going to change my world? Right? I get that there's money and it's investment and there's cost, but the bigger question is, how are you going to impact my operations? How are you going to impact the way we function and operate? Just like we're talking about vendor due diligence assessments, are you saying now that before I can bring on a vendor, I have to go through this process?
Right.
I have to change my behavior? And so oftentimes when you look at compliance readiness, it's like, hell, if we could do this in a vacuum, we could crunch it out in 3 months. But no, I have to change behavior because there's controls that get put in place, and to put a smile on an auditor's face, I have to show evidence and artifacts that controls are operational and effective, right? I can't just have the words on a page and see how great we are. They want to see actual evidence. So changing behavior and vendor due diligence is no different. The business is used to just whipping out a credit card and getting it done, right? And now we have to insert a process, and we have to educate the teams on why it's important and the risk that we're trying to mitigate along the way. But that, to me, Tim, you hit the nail on the head in terms of changing behavior in the culture is the art form that comes into not only vendor due diligence, but compliance programs at large.
And security at large, right?
100%. Yeah.
The last thing probably, we'll have to we're getting to the end of the time here, but as we're talking about this, right, because I hear this from all the MSPs in the power grid, right, it's like, great, like third-party risk. We get we're supposed to be doing it. We should be talking to our clients about it. We can't even get them to do all the security stuff for themselves that they need. How do we need to start talking about this and actioning it with them? So I'd love to hear, because Brian, you've done this for many, many years. How have you had those conversations, and how have you kind of introduced that into the continuum of the security conversation with clients? Yeah,
for sure. It usually comes under, a couple of things. When I'm doing a business impact assessment, for example, is you want to understand, again, the critical business functions that drive revenue. I've said that a million times. But at the same time, part of how they do their thing involves vendors providing products and services. So I say, I need to inventory your vendors. Okay. Then you can inventory the vendors, and then you start by saying, you know what, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Client, I'm going to make, as an MSP, I can talk to my client. Hey, I want to make sure we're not going to have to spend $1 more than you have to on security and compliance. And by doing that, I've had to do an inventory, and I've bubbled up the ones that are most critical to the things that drive you revenue. Yeah, you have 1 million vendors, I get it, but I really want to start with the most important ones. Did you know that without this specific supplier or vendor, if they go down, your whole operation shuts down? Do you agree with me? Oh yeah, if we don't have, Jane and company up and running, then we can't deliver. Okay, let's start with those. I want to inventory the vendors, and I'm going to categorize them, right? Kids, right? Pets, plants. Kids, pets, plants. So I just categorize them: tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Then I sort that, and I say, okay, I need to do some due diligence. I care about you, Mr. Customer. I care about protecting your revenue. I want to make sure you're in business tomorrow, right? And to do this, we really need to check out these. We've got this babysitter babysitting your kids over here. Have you talked to them? Do you know them? Have you checked them out? Done background check? Do you know anything? Well, yeah, let's start with those, right? And that usually gets the conversation going. Is I'm trying to protect your revenue. Here's your critical vendors that are in your critical business functions, and here's the top 5. I need to do a little project here. I need to do an engagement where I can do a risk assessment. There'll be immaterial vendors, but on your most critical ones, do you agree that you'd like to know a little bit more about how they operate and their security and their controls and things they have in place? And guess what? If they don't meet our standard, and you'd have to define that too, but if they don't meet our standard, right, then we're going to go back and we're going to negotiate or see what leverage we have with these vendors to see if they can get up to speed over a period of time.
Yeah.
You might just get another client out of it too if I'm an MSP, right?
That's-
Because it's
yeah.
like, hey, I'm talking to my clients, vendors, right? And hey, I'm helping your client. Hey, I can help
Mhm.
you too. But those usually the risk to revenue conversations come up, and there's nothing more important or significant to a business than cash flow and having money and protecting their revenue. And by saying, hey, I'm going to focus over here on the most important ones, the babysitter for the kids,
Mhm.
that's where I want to kind of focus. That's usually gets that process going. And then I usually back out of it a little bit up a level. Oh, well, we really should have a vendor, a supply chain risk management, vendor risk management policy. Do we have a set of policy? What's a policy? And blah, blah, blah.
I got one more before we run out of time here. You're doing a bake off. All right, let's say you're an MSP. You're looking at 3 vendors. I don't know, vulnerability management or something like that, right? So
Mhm.
their endpoint, right? I think I'd certainly put them in the kid category. So you're looking at 3 different babysitters. How do you triage before, obviously this process, Brian, takes a lot of time, and right. I mean, it's a big questionnaire. It's time consuming. It's money consuming, right, to go through the process. How do you triage like early? And I think we can talk to like IT providers and MSPs, right? And like they have a hard time deciding which vendors, the one they want to go with anyway, right?
Well, that's what I mean.
That's
It should never start with security and compliance. Never, ever.
Right.
I always tell the
Right.
businesses, hey,
Yeah.
it starts with come up with your business needs and your business requirements, and then we'll vet that. Never initially vet them based off of security or compliance, but the business
Right.
will come to you and
Right.
say, hey, we had this business requirements. We met with 10 vendors. We picked these 3. Let's say, I think is what you're talking about, Tim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think with RMMs, I would, if one was not hacked in the last 10 years, I'd probably go with that one, right? I mean, given the risk there, but I don't know. Just the brevity of this danger, right? So,
I agree with that. And I think like you just need to be plugged into the change management process as a security team. Like in terms of procurement and business process, they are most likely, at least in the organizations I've worked with, are going to have a place where they're entering these and doing these vendor evaluations. So I just want to get a notification of we're evaluating XYZ vendors. I don't need to send them a security questionnaire at this point. I just want to know so I can say, okay, what am I dealing with? And if I know anything specific that are going to rule out vendors, I can inject that early into the process. Any gotchas, right? Past that, like Brian said, we're going to let the business sort out what's going to work best for them. And when we get to a point where we're towards the end, then that's when we can do our full review. It's kind of like we're shifting left as much as we can in the process and getting early notification to find red flags, but then letting the business move and just attaching ourselves at the end to make sure we're doing our due diligence on those vendors.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, so it'd be a more mature organization where the tail is wagging the dog a little more, right? In terms of, but yeah, it's good to know. Yeah, as you said, business comes first. Due diligence and risk come second.
So as we head into the last 6 minutes here, we tend to like to move into like what's a key takeaway around, well, in this particular topic, vendor due diligence. Who's ready to go first?
I can jump in. I'm happy to. All right. So my key takeaway for this is to make a dynamic process and think about speed of business when you do it. I love Brian's categorization system, whatever you use for that. And then using that to attach yourself and add value throughout the process without slowing the business down. And I think, it's a great ethos for building out a risk management program for your third parties.
Oh my gosh, Jesse, with the big ethos word, we have to use that word here.
I'm just letting him go today, baby.
He's on the E in the dictionary, I think.
Yeah.
Mr. Tim, you have a key takeaway?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway, and I'm probably stealing from Brian's thunder a little bit, but big companies, they make a mistake with putting everyone through the same due diligence process, which is incredibly wasteful. So clearly, kid, dog, turtle, plant, grass, whatever, whatever many ways you want to divide it. I think that's really important. And then the scoping, as you said, also important. To what degree is the vendor touching the organization in terms of data flow and data, sensitive data? So I think just being really careful on your measured approach to this, process. So
Awesome. Mr. Brian, dropping all the wisdom bombs today. You're going to leave us with a good
Yeah,
takeaway.
well, something Tim said, and I don't want to tangent. We've only got a couple minutes, but struck a chord. It's this one size fits all risk assessments that we seem to be on the receiving end a lot. Same thing is you have to push back and say, hey, this is what you're consuming from me. Do you really need this kind of risk assessment? Oftentimes they will back down or pare down their process with you, but that's probably a topic for another day. But I think a key takeaway for me in terms of a closing thought, vendor risk assessments don't have to be overwhelming, and we don't have to over engineer them. And I came up with, you can insert whatever you want. I'm calling it kids, pets, plants in terms of a framework, but start by inventorying the vendors you have. We talked about it a little bit ago. Make a comprehensive list of the vendors that your business really relies on, right? Make that list and then easily kind of categorize them by a tier, right? A 3-tier system seems to work well for most. Tier 1, they're in our data flows, they're critical to our mission. Tier 2, they're critical to our mission. Tier 3, they're neither critical to our mission nor are they in our data flows. Right? Yikes.
That was me.
Yeah. So, and then by categorizing them, define your assessment process for each, right? The top one's the strip search, the second one, not so much, and third, even less than that. And then a monitoring. We've mentioned change management, but the big mistakes to watch out for, some wisdom, when you're assessing the vendors, also assess the vendor and the use case. What product specifically am I consuming or service, and how am I consuming that product or service? Okay. And then also have it be part of your change management process as well. So if that use case changes, then you revisit the risk assessment. Thanks.
So, I guess I should probably do this, huh? So, vendor due diligence, third-party risk. When Slack pops up right in the middle of Brian talking and sends a big notification on your screen, hey, there's risk. I should probably close Slack down next time. As far as a key takeaway, at least from my perspective, there's been a lot of really good points brought up here. As somebody that kind of had to deal with third-party risk management, vendor due diligence, and vetting, all of things as it related in my previous life, I did have that questionnaire up on screen. It was 122 questions long. That was like the base. But then I, as Brian and others have suggested, tailored that to the specific use case for that particular contract, right? Whether or not it was us asking somebody else or somebody else asking us, making sure that we were scoping that conversation appropriately. I'll give a quick anecdotal example. We were working with a major educational institute. We were going to do some data analysis and research on millions of school records. And they wanted to know all of these things and all this stuff and run us through the ringer. When I looked at the proposed contract, it literally said, we will provide you a CD for one human to utilize that disk that will be dropped off in person. So they handed me this like layered, OneTrust ServiceNow thing. And I'm looking at the contract and I'm like, all of this work for one human to read a CD that will be hand delivered and destroyed after. Yeah. No, Right? Going back to rescoping and re-saying, like, I'm not filling that whole thing out. It's literally one person.
Yeah.
Now, granted, there's risk there and it's handled, but so making sure that you're scoping these things appropriately and tailoring them accordingly.
Well put.
All right, Tim, what do we have coming up in 2 weeks? Or is that Christmas week and we're off until January?
I think we're off till January.
Oh man, I got to get some shopping done.
I think we might have one. Yeah, we may have one on that Friday 2 weeks out, but we'll see.
All right, we'll see. Off the cuff. Cool.
Off the
All right.
Well, everybody, if we don't see you in 2 weeks, it has been an honor and a blessing to continue to bring Team Tim, Brian, Jesse, all of us every other week and have this content available to you as we're planning out 2025. Head on over to the teamtim.lives, LinkedIn, maybe post a couple of topics over there as we plan out January and the rest of the year. And we are really looking forward to bringing you more and exciting, but tangible and actionable content coming forward. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great week. If we don't see you, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, or whatever other politically correct words I'm supposed to be using.
Christmas vacation.
Subscribe now.